ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. Welcome and thank you for joining us for another great deck tech on ChuckWagon MTG. Today we're bringing you Gideon's Promise, a white-blue modern build that will have your opponents wishing to never hear the word Gideon again, by controlling the board until you can send Gideon in bashing face for the win. We'll start by going over the Planeswalkers in our deck. We have 3 copies of Gideon of the Trials, a Gideon Planeswalker for 1 generic and 2 white mana that comes into the battlefield with 3 loyalty counters. He has a +1 ability of, until your next turn, prevent all damage target permanent would deal. He has a +0 ability of, until end of turn, Gideon of the Trials becomes a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a Planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. He also has a second 0 ability of, you get an emblem with, as long as you control a Gideon Planeswalker, you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Now, we're going to focus on getting him out immediately so we can use his third ability to get the emblem. Once we have that, we can use his +1 to prevent any damage from a permanent or use him to beat face if they have absolutely no one to block. Next, we have 2 copies of Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, a Gideon Planeswalker for 2 generic and 2 white mana that comes into the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters. He has a +1 ability of, until end of turn, Gideon, Ally of Zendikar becomes a 5/5 human soldier ally creature with indestructible that is still a Planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. He has a 0 ability of, put a 2/2 white knight ally creature token onto the battlefield. And then he has a -4 of, you get an emblem with creatures you control get +1/+1. Most of the time we're going to be using this Gideon to create 2/2 knights to be our blockers early game and then swing out later in the game. Up next on our Gideon roster, we have 2 copies of Gideon Jura, a Gideon Planeswalker for 3 generic and 2 white mana that comes into the battlefield with 6 loyalty counters. He has a +2 ability of, during target opponent's next turn, creatures that player controls attack Gideon Jura if able. He has a -2 ability of, destroy target tapped creature, and a 0 ability, until end of turn, Gideon Jura becomes a 6/6 human soldier creature that's still a Planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. Now, we will be using him to either divert all attacks to him until we can get all set up, or destroy one of our opponent's tapped creatures, and then later on in the game, use him as a 6/6 beat stick. And lastly, we have 2 copies of Gideon, Champion of Justice. He is a Gideon Planeswalker for 2 generic and 2 white mana that comes into the battlefield with 4 loyalty counters. He has a +1 ability of, put a loyalty counter on Gideon, Champion of Justice for each creature target opponent controls. He has a 0 ability of, until end of turn, Gideon, Champion of Justice becomes an indestructible human soldier creature with power and toughness each equal to the number of loyalty counters on him. He's still a Planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to him this turn. He also has a -15 of, exile all other permanents. Essentially, this one is going to be a beat stick. That is his main purpose in the deck. In fact, that's going to be the main win con of the deck. Once we have our emblem out, we'll start swinging with our Gideons as they all have the ability to become indestructible creatures. Next, we have some of the more fun perks of having our Gideon of the Trials emblem out, and that is pacts. We have 4 copies of Pact of Negation, an instant spell that costs 0. Pact of Negation is blue. You can counter target spell. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 3 generic and 2 blue mana. If you don't, you lose the game. We also have 3 copies of Pact of the Titan, an instant spell for 0. Pact of the Titan is red. Put a 4/4 red giant creature token into play. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 4 generic and 1 red. If you don't, you lose the game. And then we have 4 copies of Slaughter Pact, an instant spell for 0. Slaughter Pact is black. Destroy target non-black creature. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 2 generic and 1 black mana. If you don't, you lose the game. Now, all of these pacts are great in themselves, but if we have our emblem from Gideon of the Trials out and at least one Gideon Planeswalker, we can cast all of these for free, as the spells themselves only cost 0 to actually cast. And to make sure we fully enjoy each of those wonderful pact spells to the fullest, we have 4 copies of Snapcaster Mage, a 2/1 human wizard for 1 generic and 1 blue mana. It has Flash. When Snapcaster Mage enters the battlefield, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. So as long as we have our emblem and a Gideon out, we get to cast any one of our pacts twice for just 2 mana. We also have 4 copies of Opt, an instant spell for 1 blue mana. Look at the top card of your library. You may put that card on the bottom of your library. Then draw a card. This is just to help us get to what we need to a little bit quicker. Next, we have 3 copies of Path to Exile, an instant spell for 1 white mana. Remove target creature from the game. Its controller may search his or her library for a basic land card, put that card into play tapped, then shuffle his or her library. There just really isn't a better instant creature removal spell in white. And then we also have 1 copy of Imprisoned in the Moon, an enchantment aura for 2 generic and 1 blue mana. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap, add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, and loses all other card types and abilities. This is kind of a last way out for anything that happens to threaten our win conditions. For sorceries, we have 1 copy of Call of the Gatewatch, a sorcery spell for 2 generic and 1 white mana. Search your library for a planeswalker card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. Then shuffle your library. This is essentially just to grab whichever Gideon we happen to need at the time. We also have 3 copies of Chart a Course, a sorcery spell for 1 generic and 1 blue mana. Draw 2 cards. Then discard a card unless you attacked with a creature this turn. This is just another way to keep our hand full of the tricks we're going to need. And then we have 1 copy of Fumigate, a sorcery for 3 generic and 2 white mana. Destroy all creatures. You gain 1 life for each creature destroyed this way. This is here to close out any creature-heavy opponents that happen to get away from us in the early game. For our lands, we have 4 copies of Field of Ruin. It taps to add a colorless mana to your mana pool, or you can pay 2, tap it and sacrifice it. It destroys target non-basic land an opponent controls. Each player searches his or her library for a basic land card, puts it onto the battlefield, then shuffles his or her library. We also have 4 copies of Glacial Fortress, which comes into the battlefield tapped unless you control a plains or an island, and it can tap to add a white or blue mana to your mana pool. We also have 1 copy of Godless Shrine and 1 copy of Steam Vents. Both of these have, as they come into play, you may pay 2 life. If you don't, they enter the battlefield tapped. Now, these are here just for little extra insurance should we need to pay for any of our packs. We then have 5 islands, 6 plains, 1 mountain, and 1 swamp. Our sideboard consists of 3 copies of Intervention Pact, an instant spell for 0. Intervention Pact is white. The next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. You gain life equal to the damage prevented this way. At the beginning of your next upkeep, pay 1 generic and 2 white mana. If you don't, you lose the game. This is going to be good for any opponents running heavy burn, or if they're running black creatures, which kind of make your Slaughter Pact unusable. Next, we have 2 copies of Settle the Wreckage, an instant for 2 generic and 2 white mana. Exile all attacking creatures target player controls. That player may search his or her library for that many basic land cards, put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle his or her library. This is for any decks that are running hexproof or indestructible creatures. We have 3 copies of Trickbind, an instant spell for 1 generic and 1 blue mana. It has Split Second. As long as a spell is on the stack, players can't play spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. Counter target activated or triggered ability. If a permanent's ability is countered this way, activated abilities of that permanent can't be played this turn. This is essentially just to stop our opponents from getting their combos to fire off. Next, we have 2 copies of Tempest of Light, an instant spell for 2 generic and 1 white mana, destroy all enchantments. This is pretty much just for any enchantment-heavy decks that we happen to come across. We have 3 copies of Dusk and Dawn. Dusk is a sorcery for 2 generic and 2 white mana that destroys all creatures with power 3 or greater. Then on the Dawn side, it's a sorcery for 3 generic and 2 white mana. Return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand. This is essentially to deal with opponents' boards that have gotten out of control, with the added bonus of getting our Snapcaster Mages back. Lastly, we have 2 copies of Consulate Crackdown, an enchantment for 3 generic mana and 2 white mana. When Consulate Crackdown enters the battlefield, exile all artifacts your opponents control until Consulate Crackdown leaves the battlefield. This is just in case we happen to run up against any affinity or artifact type decks. Well, there you have it. Gideon's Promise is a fun deck that can overpower your opponents with its abuse of the pact spells while beating face with our selection of Gideons. Now, if you happen to play this deck at a tournament or even at your kitchen table, please drop us a comment and let us know down below how you did. Well, thank you all very much for watching. If you liked what you saw here today, click that like button, hit subscribe, and share to your heart's content. Share it with your friends, your family, your loved ones, and your pets. Everyone could use a little more magic in their lives. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and as always, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, ChuckWagon MTG. Now, if you take a brief moment and check out this message about our sponsor. ChuckWagon MTG is sponsored by BC Comics and Games. They have 3 different locations, and they run Magic events every Monday through Saturday, and their Friday Night Magic consists of Standard, Modern, and Legacy every week. This is why I've personally made BC Comics and Games my home gaming store.